Venezuela does what others only threatened. Let me take you back to January 10th of this year, not because it was a day of fireworks or dramatic headlines, but because it was the day Venezuela did something that no one in the Western Hemisphere had dared to do in decades. With a single, almost casual announcement, Nicolas Maduro declared that his government would annex a vast swath of neighboring Guyana, a territory known as Essequibo, rich in oil, gold, and untapped strategic potential. The move was met with predictable outrage from Washington, London, and Brussels, but here's the: it wasn't just outrageous. It was historically significant. Because for the first time since the Monroe Doctrine was declared in 1823, a Latin American nation had unilaterally redrawn its borders by force, defying the unspoken rule that only great powers get to do that sort of thing. Now, I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying the intersection of geopolitics, resource competition, and the slow unraveling of American hegemony. And let me tell you, this isn't just another flare-up in a forgotten corner of the world. This is a test case, a moment where the rules of the post-Cold War order are being rewritten in real time. The mainstream media has framed this as a simple case of Venezuelan aggression, a rogue state biting off more than it can chew. But that's not the full story. Not even close. Here's what they want you to: Venezuela, a country already crippled by economic collapse, hyperinflation, and international sanctions, suddenly decided on a whim to pick a fight with Guyana, a former British colony now backed by ExxonMobil, the US military, and a network of Western energy interests. The official narrative goes something like: Maduro, facing an election later this year and desperate to rally nationalist support, dusted off an old territorial dispute over Essequibo, a region that makes up 2/3 of Guyana's landmass, and held a referendum in December 2023 where 95% of voters supposedly approved annexation. Then, in January, he followed through, sending troops to the border, issuing decrees, and even unveiling a new official map that incorporated Essequibo into Venezuela. The US responded with joint military exercises with Guyana, the UK sent a warship to the region, and the UN Security Council held emergency sessions. Case closed, right? Venezuela is the villain, Guyana the victim, and the West is once again the righteous enforcer of international law. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. The data doesn't support it. Not the way they're presenting it. For starters, that 95% referendum figure? Independent observers, including the Carter Center, have cast serious doubt on its legitimacy. Turnout was suspiciously low. Some estimates suggest as few as 20% of eligible voters participated, and the question was framed in such a way that opposing it would have been political suicide. Then there's the timing. Why now? Why, after decades of simmering tension, did Maduro suddenly decide to make his move in 2024? The answer isn't just about domestic politics. It's about geopolitics. And oil. And, most importantly, the shifting balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. Here's what's really: Venezuela isn't acting alone. And this isn't just about Essequibo. This is about the slow-motion collapse of American influence in Latin America, the rise of a new multipolar order, and the desperate attempts by Washington to cling to a unipolar world that no longer exists. Let me break it down. First, the resource angle. Essequibo isn't just a patch of jungle, it's a potential energy superpower. Since ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves there in 2015, Guyana's GDP has grown by over 600%, making it the fastest-growing economy in the world. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that Guyana's offshore fields could hold up to 11 billion barrels of oil, more than Kuwait. And Venezuela? It sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, but years of mismanagement, sanctions, and brain drain have left its industry in shambles. For Maduro, Essequibo isn't just a territorial dispute, it's an economic lifeline. And for the U.S., it's a non-negotiable red line. Because if Venezuela succeeds in seizing even a fraction of those reserves, it would send a message to every other energy-rich nation in that the U.S. can't protect you anymore. But here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela isn't just defying the U.S. It's doing so with the tacit support of 2 other major: Russia and China. And that changes everything. Over the past decade, as U.S. sanctions have crippled Venezuela's economy, Maduro has turned to Moscow and Beijing for survival. Russia has sent military advisors, supplied weapons, and even deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. China, meanwhile, has become Venezuela's largest creditor, providing billions in loans secured by oil shipments. And both countries have a vested interest in seeing the US humiliated in its own backyard. For Russia, it's about distracting Washington from Ukraine. For China, it's about securing a foothold in the Western Hemisphere and undermining US energy dominance. And for Venezuela? It's about survival. Now, let me be, I'm not saying this is some grand conspiracy. This isn't about secret backroom deals where Putin and Xi Jinping gave Maduro a green light. It's about something far more dangerous: strategic convergence. Three authoritarian regimes, each with their own grievances against the US, all seeing an opportunity to weaken American influence in a region Washington has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. And they're doing it not with tanks and invasions, but with economic leverage, military posturing, and the slow erosion of US credibility. This brings us to the broader geopolitical context. What we're witnessing in Venezuela isn't just a local conflict. It's a microcosm of the new Cold War, a struggle between a declining unipolar power and a rising multipolar bloc. And the rules of this new game are different. In the old Cold War, the US and USSR divided the world into spheres of influence, with each side enforcing its will through proxies and military alliances. Today, the competition is more fluid, more economic, and far more dangerous because the stakes aren't just ideological, they're existential. Consider in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war because the US refused to tolerate Soviet missiles in its backyard. Today, the US has military bases in over 80 countries, conducts regime change operations with alarming regularity, and enforces sanctions that starve civilian populations, all while lecturing other nations about sovereignty and international law. The hypocrisy is staggering. And it's not lost on the rest of the world. Venezuela's move on Essequibo is a direct challenge to that hypocrisy. It's saying, if the US can invade Iraq, if NATO can bomb Libya, if Israel can annex the Golan Heights, then why can't we reclaim what we see as our historic territory? Now, I'm not defending Maduro's actions. Far from it. But we have to understand the logic behind them. Because in a world where the US no longer has the moral or economic authority to enforce its will, other nations are going to start testing the limits. And Venezuela is just the beginning. Let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has responded to Venezuela's annexation threats with a show of force. In December, the US Southern Command conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, including air and naval drills. The UK sent the HMS Trent, a patrol vessel, to Guyana's waters. And the US has quietly extended its military presence in the region, including at a new base in Guyana's capital, Georgetown. On paper, this looks like a classic deterrence: signal strength, draw red lines, and hope the other side backs down. But here's the deterrence: only works if the other side believes you're willing to follow through. And in this case, there's good reason to doubt that. Let me tell you something I've learned from studying military interventions over the past 3. The US is very good at starting wars. It's terrible at finishing them. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these weren't just failures of execution. They were failures of strategy. The US has a habit of underestimating the costs of intervention, overestimating its ability to control outcomes, and ignoring the long-term consequences of its actions. And Venezuela? It's a perfect storm of all three. First, the costs. Venezuela isn't some weak, isolated state like Grenada in 1983. It's a nation of 28 million people with a standing army of over 100,000, a well-armed militia, and a population that, despite its suffering, remains deeply nationalistic. Any US military action, even a limited strike, would risk triggering a protracted insurgency, not just in Venezuela but across Latin America. Remember, the US has a long and bloody history in the region, from the Bay of Pigs to Operation Condor. The memory of that history is still fresh. And the idea that the US could conduct a quick, surgical operation without getting bogged down in a quagmire is, frankly, delusional. Second, the control. Even if the US managed to overthrow Maduro, which, given his grip on power, is far from guaranteed, what then? Venezuela is a deeply divided country. The opposition is fractured, the military is loyal to Maduro, and the economy is in ruins. The US would inherit a failed state, with all the attendant mass migration, drug trafficking, and the very real risk of a humanitarian catastrophe. And let's not the last time the US tried to install a friendly government in Venezuela, in 2002, it ended in a spectacular failure when Hugo Chavez was restored to power within 48 hours. Third, the consequences. A US intervention in Venezuela wouldn't just be a regional disaster. It would be a global one. Russia and China have both warned that they would view any military action as a direct threat to their interests. And they're not bluffing. Russia has already sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in the past. China, meanwhile, has invested billions in the country and has no interest in seeing its assets seized by a US-backed government. The risk of escalation, whether intentional or accidental, is real. And in a world where great powers are already on a hair trigger, that's a risk no one can afford. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimension. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about American politics. And that's where things get really messy. Maduro's move on Essequibo didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in an election year in the US, with a president who was deeply unpopular and facing a tight race against a candidate who has made no secret of his disdain for international law. And that changes the calculus in Washington. Joe Biden is in a bind. On one hand, he can't afford to look weak on Venezuela. His administration has already been criticized for its handling of the border crisis, which has seen record numbers of Venezuelan migrants crossing into the US. If he does nothing, he risks looking like he's ceding ground to a dictator. On the other hand, if he overreacts, say, by launching a military strike, he risks handing Donald Trump a perfect campaign. Biden got us into another war. And in a swing state like Florida, where Venezuelan exiles wield significant political influence, that's a non-starter. Then there's the role of key administration figures. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been vocal in his condemnation of Venezuela's actions, but he's also a known advocate of diplomacy. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, meanwhile, is a retired general who understands the risks of military intervention better than most. And Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is caught between the hawks in Congress and the realists in the Pentagon. The result? A policy that's reactive, inconsistent, and ultimately driven more by domestic politics than by strategic logic. This is the problem with American foreign policy today. It's not just that the US is overextended. It's that its foreign policy is increasingly hostage to domestic political incentives. And in an era of polarization and short-term thinking, that's a recipe for disaster. So where does this leave us? What happens next? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios, each with its own set of risks and probabilities. Scenario: the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, cooler heads prevail. The US and its allies continue to apply economic pressure on Venezuela, but they stop short of military action. Maduro, facing internal dissent and economic collapse, agrees to a negotiated settlement, perhaps a joint development deal for Essequibo's resources, or a face-saving compromise that allows him to claim victory without actually annexing the territory. The International Court of Justice rules in Guyana's favor, and Venezuela, isolated and weakened, backs down. This is the best-case scenario. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because Maduro has already burned his bridges. He's staked his political survival on this issue, and backing down now would be seen as a sign of weakness. Moreover, the US has already ruled out direct negotiations with Venezuela, preferring to deal with Guyana as the aggrieved party. And without a credible off-ramp, Maduro has no incentive to de-escalate. Scenario: the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. Venezuela doesn't actually invade Essequibo, but it doesn't back down either. Instead, it maintains a low-level insurgency, funding proxy groups in the region, harassing Guyanese forces, and keeping the dispute alive. The US responds with sanctions, military aid to Guyana, and occasional shows of force, but stops short of direct intervention. The conflict becomes a permanent fixture of the regional landscape, much like the dispute between India and Pakistan over Kashmir or the standoff between China and Taiwan. This scenario is dangerous because it normalizes instability. It turns Essequibo into a flashpoint that could explode at any moment, whether through miscalculation, provocation, or a sudden shift in the balance of power. And it sets if Venezuela can get away with this, what's to stop Nicaragua from making a play for Costa Rica, or Bolivia from reviving its claims to Chile's coastline? Scenario: the escalation spiral. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Chinese support, actually invades Essequibo. The US responds with airstrikes, cyber attacks, or even a limited ground operation. Russia and China, in turn, escalate their support for Venezuela, perhaps by sending military advisors, or by conducting their own exercises in the region. The conflict spreads, drawing in other actors like Brazil, Colombia, and Cuba. And before long, what started as a territorial dispute becomes a full-blown regional war. This scenario is unlikely, but not impossible. And the problem is, once the spiral starts, it's almost impossible to stop. The US has a long history of underestimating its adversaries, and Venezuela, despite its economic woes, is not Iraq in 2003. It's a nation with a proud military tradition, a population that has endured decades of hardship, and allies who are willing to go to the mat for it. A war in Venezuela wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be clean. And the consequences would be felt far beyond the region. Now, let's out even further. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the grand strategy of American hegemony and why it's failing. For the past 3 decades, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the belief that it can, and should, shape the world in its own image through military force, economic coercion, and the promotion of democracy. This doctrine has led to a series of disastrous interventions, from Iraq to Libya to Afghanistan, and has left the US overextended, unpopular, and increasingly irrelevant in a world that no longer wants to be shaped in its image. The problem isn't just that this strategy is expensive. It's that it's unsustainable. The US accounts for about 25% of global GDP, but it spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. It maintains over 750 military bases in 80 countries. And it enforces sanctions on nearly a third of the world's population. This isn't strength. It's imperial overstretch. And it's a recipe for decline. Venezuela is just the latest symptom of that decline. The US no longer has the economic or moral authority to enforce its will in its own backyard. And as other powers, China, Russia, Iran, sense that weakness, they're going to start testing the limits. We've already seen it in Ukraine, where Russia has defied Western sanctions and continued its war. We've seen it in the Middle East, where Iran has exited its influence despite US pressure. And now we're seeing it in Latin America, where Venezuela is calling Washington's bluff. The question: what should the US do instead? Here's my controversial: the US needs to abandon the fantasy of liberal hegemony and embrace a strategy of great power management. That means recognizing that the world is no longer unipolar, and that trying to maintain that unipolarity is a fool's errand. It means accepting that other nations, even authoritarian ones, have legitimate interests, and that the US can't dictate outcomes everywhere. And it means focusing on what the US does, deterring major wars, protecting its core alliances, and maintaining its economic and technological edge. In practical terms, that means a few things. First, the US should stop treating Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. That doesn't mean abandoning the region, far from it. It means engaging with it on equal terms, respecting its sovereignty, and working with its governments, even the ones we don't like, to address shared challenges like migration, drug trafficking, and climate change. Second, the US should dial back the sanctions. Sanctions don't work. They didn't work in Cuba, they didn't work in Iran, and they're not working in Venezuela. All they do is punish civilian populations, drive target nations into the arms of the very powers we're trying to contain. Look at this: since the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela in 2017, the country's oil production has collapsed from 2.1 million barrels per day to just 700,000 in 2023, a 67% decline. But has Maduro fallen? No. Has the regime changed? No. What has happened is that Venezuela has deepened its ties with China, which now buys nearly 60% of its oil, and Russia, which has provided military advisors and intelligence support. The sanctions didn't weaken the regime, they weakened the US position in the region. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader erosion of US military credibility in Latin America. For decades, the Pentagon has treated the region as a low-priority backwater, assuming that a few naval patrols and occasional special forces deployments would be enough to keep things under control. But that assumption is crumbling. In 2022, Russia and Nicaragua signed a military cooperation agreement that allows Russian troops to train on Nicaraguan soil. China has built a deep-water port in El Salvador and is exiting its military ties with Cuba. Iran has opened a drone factory in Venezuela and is reportedly sharing intelligence with the Maduro regime. And let's not forget the Wagner Group, which has been active in the region for years, providing security for Venezuelan gold mines and training local forces. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is losing its military edge in its own hemisphere. And it's not because of some grand conspiracy, it's because Washington has spent the last 20 years fighting wars in the Middle East while its adversaries have been quietly building influence in Latin America. The US Southern Command, which is responsible for the region, has seen its budget slashed by nearly 40% since 2010. Meanwhile, China's military spending in Latin America has increased by over 300% in the same period. The result? A growing number of countries in the region are hedging their bets, balancing between Washington and its rivals. Let me explain why this matters. Latin America isn't just some distant theater, it's a critical strategic flank for the United States. The AMA Canal, the Caribbean shipping lanes, the proximity to the U.S. homeland, these are all vital interests. If China or Russia were to establish a permanent military presence in the region, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. We're not there yet, but the trends are worrying. In 2023, the U.S. Navy conducted just 12 freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, but only 2 in the Caribbean. That's a ratio of 6-to-1 in favor of Asia. And while the U.S. is focused on Taiwan, China is quietly exiting its footprint in the U.S.'s backyard. So what should the U.S. do? First, it needs to recognize that military power alone won't solve this problem. The days of the Monroe Doctrine are over. No amount of gunboat diplomacy is going to convince Latin American countries to fall in line behind Washington. Instead, the U.S. needs to compete in the realm of economics and diplomacy. That means investing in infrastructure, trade, and development, not just in the region's democracies, but in its autocracies too. It means offering alternatives to Chinese loans and Russian arms sales. And it means accepting that some countries, like Venezuela, are going to make choices that we don't like. Second, the U.S. needs to rethink its approach to military engagement in the region. That doesn't mean invading countries or staging coups, those days are long gone. But it does mean modernizing Southern Command, increasing naval patrols in the Caribbean, and working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to counterbalance Chinese and Russian influence. It also means being more selective about where and how the U.S. projects power. The U.S. doesn't need to be everywhere, but it does need to be in the right places at the right times. Finally, the U.S. needs to accept that it can't control everything. Venezuela's defiance isn't a sign of U.S. weakness, it's a sign of a multipolar world. The sooner Washington accepts that, the sooner it can start crafting a strategy that actually works. The alternative is a slow, painful decline, where the U.S. finds itself increasingly isolated in its own hemisphere. And that's a future no one should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just a foreign policy headache for Washington, it's a domestic political earthquake for Caracas itself. The Maduro regime has spent the last decade consolidating power through a mix of repression, economic mismanagement, and sheer survival instinct, but the recent moves, like the Essequibo Gambit, aren't just about geopolitics. They're about regime preservation. And that's where things get really interesting. Let me explain why this matters. Since 2018, when Maduro won a second term in an election widely condemned as fraudulent, Venezuela's political opposition has been in a state of perpetual disarray. The U.S. and its allies recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president in 2019, but that strategy backfired spectacularly. Guaidó's parallel government never gained real traction, and by 2023, even the U.S. had quietly walked back its support. The opposition's problem wasn't just that it was divided, though it was, but that it failed to offer a credible alternative to Maduro's rule. The regime, for all its brutality, had one thing the opposition didn't: control of the streets, the military, and, crucially, the narrative. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's recent escalations aren't just about thumbing his nose at the US. They're about shoring up his domestic legitimacy at a time when his grip on power is more fragile than it appears. The economy is a disaster. GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, inflation hit 234% in 2023, and oil production, once the lifeblood of the country, is down to about 750,000 barrels per day, a fraction of its peak. But Maduro has survived worse. The key to his longevity has been his ability to play different factions within the Chavista movement against each other while keeping the military on side. That's no small feat in a country where the armed forces have historically been the kingmakers. So how does the Essequibo dispute fit into this? It's a rallying cry. Nationalism has always been the regime's ace in the hole. Back in 2007, when Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry, he framed it as a battle against imperialism. When he expropriated land and businesses, it was about defending the revolution. Maduro is doing the same thing now, but with a twist. By stoking tensions with Guyana, he's not just distracting from economic misery, he's positioning himself as the defender of Venezuela's sovereignty against foreign encroachment. And it's working, at least for now. Polls show that even among opposition supporters, there's broad agreement that the Essequibo belongs to Venezuela. That's a rare point of consensus in a deeply polarized country. But here's where the story gets complicated. Maduro's strategy is a high-wire act, and the risks are real. The military, which has been the backbone of his rule, is not a monolith. There are factions within the armed forces that are unhappy with the status quo, and there have been whispers of discontent for years. In 2019, a group of officers led by General Raul Bajual, once a close ally of Chavez, was arrested for allegedly plotting a coup. In 2020, another group of soldiers was accused of planning to assassinate Maduro. The regime has responded with purges, but the underlying tensions haven't gone away. Then there's the question of succession. Maduro is 61, and while he shows no signs of stepping down, no autocrat lasts forever. The Chavista movement is deeply divided over who should replace him. There are the hardliners, like Diosdado Cabello, the former National Assembly president and head of the Constituent Assembly, who represents the old guard of the revolution. Then there are the pragmatists, like Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who are more open to negotiating with the opposition and the West. The Essequibo dispute is, in part, a way for Maduro to signal to both factions that he's still in control. But if the crisis escalates, it could also force a reckoning within the regime. Now, let's talk about the opposition. For years, the US and its allies have pinned their hopes on a democratic transition in Venezuela, but that's looking increasingly unlikely. The opposition is fractured, and its leaders are either in exile, in prison, or marginalized. The most recent attempted dialogue, brokered by Norway in 2023, collapsed when the regime walked away from the table. The opposition's biggest problem is that it has no leverage. The US has eased some sanctions in exchange for minor concessions, like allowing the UN to monitor elections, but Maduro has no incentive to make real reforms. Why would he? The sanctions relief has given him just enough breathing room to stabilize the economy, at least for now, without ceding any real power. So what's the most likely scenario? In the short term, Maduro will continue to play the nationalist card, using the Essequibo dispute to rally support and keep the opposition on the back foot. He'll also continue to court China and Russia, not just for geopolitical reasons, but because he needs their money. China has already invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector, and Russia has provided military and intelligence support. But neither country is going to bail Venezuela out of its economic mess. China, in particular, has been cautious about throwing good money after bad. In 2023, it restructured Venezuela's debt, but it's not clear how much more it's willing to invest. In the medium term, the biggest risk for Maduro is a split within the military. If the economic situation deteriorates further, or if the regime's repression becomes too heavy-handed, we could see a palace coup. That's not the same as a democratic transition, far from it, but it could lead to a more pragmatic faction taking power, one that's willing to negotiate with the West. The other possibility is that Maduro doubles down on repression, using the Essequibo crisis to justify a crackdown on dissent. That's a dangerous game, but it's one he's played before. In the long term, Venezuela's future depends on the price of oil and the stability of the regime. If oil prices rise, Maduro could buy himself more time. If they stay low, the economic pressure will mount. And if the regime collapses, it won't be because of U.S. sanctions or opposition protests, it will be because the military decides it's had enough. That's the lesson of history in Latin America. The armed forces are the ultimate arbiters of power, and in Venezuela, they're the ones calling the shots. So where does that leave the U.S.? The Biden administration has been walking a tightrope, trying to balance pressure on Maduro with the need to avoid another humanitarian crisis. The recent easing of sanctions was a pragmatic move, but it's not a long-term solution. The U.S. needs to accept that Venezuela is not going to return to democracy anytime soon, and that any strategy that relies on regime change is doomed to fail. Instead, it should focus on containing the fallout from Venezuela's collapse, working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to manage migration and drug trafficking, and keeping a close eye on China's growing influence in the region. The uncomfortable truth is that Venezuela is a cautionary tale about the limits of U.S. power. For decades, Washington has treated Latin America as its backyard, but those days are over. The region is more independent, more assertive, and more willing to defy the U.S. than ever before. Venezuela's defiance isn't just a challenge to U.S. hegemony, it's a symptom of a broader shift in the global order. And the sooner the U.S. accepts that, the better off it will be. The alternative is a world where the U.S. is increasingly irrelevant in its own hemisphere, and that's a future no one should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's gambit in Essequibo isn't just about territory, it's about rewriting the rules of engagement in Latin America. The establishment narrative in Washington and Brussels frames this as another case of a rogue regime acting out, but that's a dangerous oversimplification. Maduro isn't just lashing out, he's testing a new playbook, one where small states leverage great power rivalries to punch above their weight. And if he succeeds, even partially, we'll see copycats from Nicaragua to Bolivia. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The Essequibo dispute is a microcosm of how the global South is adapting to a multipolar world. For decades, the U.S. and its allies could rely on economic coercion as sanctions, IMF conditionalities, trade deals to keep Latin American governments in line. But Maduro has turned that logic on its head. By leaning into China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's security guarantees, he's created a buffer against Western pressure. The $16 billion in Chinese investments since 2018, the Russian Wagner Group's presence in the Orinoco mining belt, and the recent oil-for-debt deals with Iran aren't just transactional, they're structural. They're proof that Venezuela has built an alternative economic ecosystem, one that doesn't need the US dollar or the IMF's approval to function. Here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy establishment still hasn't internalized this shift. When I talk to officials in the State Department, there's a palpable frustration that Maduro isn't playing by the old rules. But that's the point, he's not. The sanctions regime, which once crippled Iran and North Korea, has been rendered porous by Venezuela's alliances. The 2023 easing of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector wasn't just a policy adjustment, it was an admission of failure. The Biden administration realized that starving Venezuela of revenue only pushed it deeper into China's orbit. The $3.2 billion in Venezuelan oil exports to China in the first half of 2024, despite U.S. sanctions, tells you everything you need to know about who's winning this game. So what are the alternatives? The first is containment, which is what the U.S. is already doing, albeit half-heartedly. The problem is that containment only works if you have partners on the ground, and in Latin America, those partners are increasingly unreliable. Colombia's Petro government has pivoted toward dialogue with Maduro, Brazil's Lula is more interested in regional stability than regime change, and even Mexico's López Obrador has refused to isolate Venezuela. The second alternative is engagement, but on what terms? The 2024 Barbados Agreement, which promised free elections in Venezuela in exchange for sanctions relief, collapsed because neither side trusted the other. Maduro used the negotiations to buy time, while the U.S. saw them as a way to legitimize the opposition. Neither got what they wanted. The third alternative is the most escalation. Some in Washington are pushing for a harder line, secondary sanctions on Chinese banks, a naval blockade of Venezuelan oil shipments, even covert support for opposition groups. But that's a recipe for disaster. The last time the US tried regime change in Latin America, in 2002 with the failed coup against Chavez, it backfired spectacularly. Today, with China and Russia in the mix, the stakes are even higher. A US military intervention is off the table. No one wants another Iraq, but even economic warfare could trigger a humanitarian catastrophe. Venezuela's GDP has already shrunk by 75% since 2013. Another round of sanctions could push it into Somalia-level collapse, with millions more fleeing to Colombia, Brazil, and the US. The final alternative is the hardest to acceptance. Not of Maduro's legitimacy, but of the reality that Venezuela is no longer a US client state and never will be again. That doesn't mean disengagement, far from it. It means shifting from a strategy of regime change to one of damage control. The US should focus on three: first, working with regional allies to manage migration flows, which are already straining Colombia and the US southern border; second, countering Chinese and Russian influence by offering real economic alternatives, not just moralizing about democracy; and third, preparing for the day when the Venezuelan military finally turns on Maduro. Because that's how this ends, not with a revolution, but with a coup. Let me be, I'm not saying the US should abandon its values or stop supporting democracy in Venezuela. But values don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be balanced against interests, and right now, the US interest in Venezuela is stability, not regime change. The establishment narrative in Washington still frames this as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, but that's a 20th century lens for a 21st century problem. The real battle is between order and chaos, and Maduro, for all his flaws, is the devil we know. Here's the grand strategy: what happens when other countries in the region take note of Venezuela's playbook. Bolivia's Morales already tried to nationalize his country's lithium reserves, only to be reined in by the military. Argentina's Milei is flirting with dollarization, but if he fails, Buenos Aires could turn to Beijing for a lifeline. Even Mexico, long the US's closest partner in Latin America, is hedging its bets. López Obrador's refusal to condemn Maduro's Essequibo gambit wasn't just diplomatic posturing, it was a signal that Mexico is no longer willing to be Washington's enforcer in the region. The lesson for the US is that Latin America is no longer a monolith. The old model of hegemony, where the US could dictate terms through the OAS or the IMF, is dead. The new model is one of competition, where China, Russia, and even Iran are offering alternatives to US leadership. Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine. If the US can't find a way to engage with the region on its own terms, it will find itself increasingly irrelevant, not just in Caracas, but in Bogotá, Brasilia, and Mexico City. So where does that leave us? With a choice. The US can double down on a strategy that has failed for 2 decades, or it can adapt to a world where power is diffuse, alliances are fluid, and small states have more agency than ever before. The first option leads to more crises, more migration, and more Chinese influence. The second requires humility, pragmatism, and a willingness to accept that the US is no longer the sole arbiter of Latin America's fate. I've spent my career studying how empires decline, and the most dangerous moment isn't when they're challenged, it's when they refuse to see the challenge for what it is. Venezuela isn't just a problem to be solved, it's a symptom of a larger shift. The question isn't whether the US can turn back the clock. It can't. The question is whether it can navigate a world where its influence is no longer absolute. And right now, the signs aren't encouraging.